You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Tiffany Cruikshank. Our podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts, Rachel Land and Katja Bartsch, as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness. Welcome back. I am excited to have Katja here to fill us in on some new research and information as it comes out. There's still, as you'll see, a lot to learn on this subject, but talking about female hormones, the immune system, and the inflammatory response in regards to exercise and things like training for your cycle, I think have been really popular in the media lately. And so looking at some of this newer research, I think is really interesting and helpful and, hopefully bring some new information to you and give you some more to work with. But I'm excited to be here to learn as well. So thanks, Katja.
Yeah, I find this topic really interesting as it is emerging in the research. So what we've picked out for you today are two pieces of research, basically, which we will link to in the show notes. One is a systematic review and meta-analysis, and the other one is also a systematic review, meaning that it consolidates multiple pieces of research. So it's already trying to make sense of the emerging research out there, which sometimes is contradictory and sometimes we may have a hard time to kind of get a grasp on. So that's what we'll aim to do today.
Yeah, and I think inflammation is one of those kind of loaded words too, because it tends to get a bad rap, but it also plays a lot of valuable roles. So I think we'll feel that, I'm assuming, in today's too, of like, it kind of depends on the situation. Pro, anti-inflammatory. Yeah. What do you want?
That's definitely the right notion to go into. It depends. And also I want to give a little disclaimer as we start, because in the research, but even more so on a podcast where we try to distill information for you guys, the immune system and inflammatory response we're trying to boil that down, while in fact it's such a complex system with so many different pathways interacting and really complicated crosstalks on a biochemical or really detailed level. So just know that we're trying to get that major information across, while in fact it's a bit more complicated, or at least it is a very complex system. So know that. And then also, as you may have heard in other episodes that we discussed on the menstrual cycle or female hormones, this is also an ongoing caveat almost, that menstrual cycle research still is facing methodological challenges as well. So the research is getting better from a methodological standpoint, but the stuff that we have right now, which we would for instance, consolidate in a meta-analysis like this, for example, just most of the time compares the follicular phase, so the first phase of the cycle, with the luteal phase. And for example, the time around ovulation, which might be pretty interesting also for the immune system inflammatory response, where estrogen is high, but progesterone is not yet high. That is oftentimes not reflected in the research because it's really hard to determine from a practical standpoint. Getting women in at the right time is really, really complicated. I know that from own experience in the research. So that's what we have to work with. So know that as well, that the granularity of what we would like to see or what we would hope to see is developing as we speak.
That's so important. Yeah. And so interesting. Yeah. I'm glad that there's more spotlight coming to it. So do we want to start talking about just inflammation and immune system in general?
Yeah, let's do that. Let's just take a bird's eye view just to get some of the words or terms across that we will find later in the research findings. So two systems or two parts of the immune system that the research will refer to is the innate immune system and then the adaptive immune system. And those are really not separate from each other. They're really intertwined in many complex crosstalk processes, act in concert with each other. So that's a really complicated process, as I already mentioned. So keep that in mind. And the innate immune system is kind of like your body's first line of defense. So it's pretty quick. But it's also more unspecific, and that is being carried out by cells. So, for example, monocytes, macrophages, natural killer cells, neutrophils, etc. So you may have heard of those. Those are part of that first line of defense, non-specific first line of defense. And that is supported also by a so-called humoral part of the innate immune system, meaning that there are proteins such as cytokines that kind of mediate or orchestrate how all those cells come in and who does what and who goes where. So they're basically the conductor of the whole show. So that's the innate one. And then we also have the adaptive immune system, which is more specific. And that also consists both of cells and then those humoral parts. So in the cells, you may have heard of the adaptive immune system are the T cells. So you may have heard of T helper cells or T killer cells. Those are part of that system. And then again, we will have cytokines orchestrating that whole process or all of those processes. And also antibodies, which are produced by B lymphocytes, they are also part of that adaptive immune system. So takeaway, innate immune system, quick general line of defense, also thought actually to play a role in reproductive processes such as menstrual cycle or the menses and ovulation, also involved in some of the repair processes in regeneration of skeletal muscle, for example. And the other adaptive, a bit more specific. And they really interact in concert with each other.
Great. Yeah, I think that's a helpful quick overview. So then as we start to bring it together and look at now we get to the juicy part, the influence on the menstrual cycle and what does all this mean to the menstrual cycle?
Yeah. And what we see here, as we can see with most other cells in the body, is that immune cells also show receptors or express receptors, for example, for estrogen and progesterone. So those two have been primarily discussed as we talk about menstrual cycle phases or also the menopausal transition. And since they express receptors for female sex hormone, it's not a far reach to hypothesize that changes in female hormone may also impact those immune processes. So that's the general premise there.
Yeah, I think a big finding too, finding those estrogen receptors. I know that was a big one. And now starting to get a handle on, what does that mean? How does that actually translate when we talk about estrogen and progesterone in particular?
Yeah, that's where it gets really interesting. That's also where you may have heard specific recommendations on lifestyle interventions or exercise regimens. For example, do train in this phase or do not train in that phase because the inflammatory response may be elevated and so on. So that's kind of what triggered this episode almost, that we have a lot of that info out there. And so the general premise, again, is that estrogen, as I already mentioned, acts or can have an influence on the immune system response and the inflammatory response. And the general thought or hypothesis is that estrogen has more of an anti-inflammatory effect, for example, through expressing certain anti-inflammatory cytokines. So that's the overall, let's say, assumption. However, that may also not be as straightforward as we would like it to be, because there seems to be a so-called dose response effect. So high levels of estrogen, which we find throughout the menstrual cycle or maybe also during ovulation, for example, they are thought to be more related to anti-inflammatory effects. And low amounts of estrogen, for example, also as we see in or after menopause, those are then more associated with pro-inflammatory processes. And that's kind of in line with findings you may have heard of, that menopause is also sometimes viewed as this low-level, low-grade inflammatory process. So that's something that's been out there a lot. So we do find more pro-inflammatory markers in or after menopause specifically. And that's probably because of immune cells themselves. Also, and that's just a side note I wanted to add, we can see that the sympathetic nervous system also is more upregulated in women than in men of that age, and that may also play a role in that. But overall, estrogen is thought to have more anti-inflammatory properties.
Yes. And as a side note, if you're listening to this, if you want more about menopause, we do have a full course on that just to, give you a lot of information and more to work with. Depending on when you're listening to this, we may be running it live soon, or you might have to wait a little bit, but we do run it regularly. So you can check that out on our website, yogamedicine.com.
Yeah, excited for that one.
Yes.
And of course, we will not only talk about estrogen, even though that's probably the one that is most mentioned also in the research, but of course, we'll also talk about progesterone. And interestingly, high levels of progesterone are assumed to have the same anti-inflammatory effects as estrogen. So how is that shown in the research? So in line with that, it was or has been reported, for example, that progesterone A can inhibit the expression of pro-inflammatory cytokines from mast cells, for example. So it basically dials down those pro-inflammatory cytokines that are being expressed by some immune cells. That's one. And then also they may impact pro-inflammatory cytokines directly. So those two, pathways, for example, have been discussed in the pieces of research that I'm sharing. There is more. Know that we're always trying to kind of pick some highlights that already consolidate some of the research out there. So that's from one of those two articles that I'm sharing also in the show notes. And this also clinically has, for example, been related to changes in allergies. So there have been reports that when we are after ovulation and progesterone is rising, that in that period, the occurrence or symptoms of allergies may decrease. So higher progesterone in that second phase of the cycle may lead to less asthmatic or allergic, let's say not asthmatic, allergic symptoms, while at the beginning of the cycle, during bleeding, when there's very low levels of progesterone to be observed, then the occurrence of allergic symptoms rises. And also, again, a bit in line with menopause, because we see that after menopause with low progesterone, we see the onset of a lot of those allergic diseases after that as well.
Interesting. I love that.
Yeah. However, so we find that interesting. It's a good takeaway. It may assume that the second phase of the cycle with high estrogen and high progesterone may pose anti-inflammatory scenarios, basically. But
which is good, but not always good.
Good, but not always good. Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's the first takeaway. Anti or pro-inflammatory is not black or white, good or bad. So it's always the balance. So we'll come to that in a minute. But for example, in response to exercise, there's always after exercise a pro-inflammatory phase that kind of initiates that first part or phase of regeneration, and then an anti-inflammatory wave kind of comes in to find that perfect balance to not overdo that inflammatory process. So it's always about the balance. It's always about that complex combination or complex interplay. So I think that's one takeaway that's really, really important. Also, as you look at social media, pro or anti-inflammatory responses are not per se good or bad. And then they also may be different for someone with an autoimmune condition or someone without such a condition. So it really, really depends. And in many cases, those findings that I'm talking about today, some of them also from cell cultures, we don't 100% know yet how to really translate that into clinical findings. So sometimes we know that from cell cultures, but if that then translates into actual practice and clinical practice, that's more of a question mark.
Yeah, not only into humans, but then also into physically active, maybe competitive, maybe highly active. Like, how does that translate into performance and training?
Definitely. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. There's little research, but we have some and we'll look at it. So as I mentioned before, we could assume that the second phase of the menstrual cycle after ovulation with high progesterone, high estrogen, that this might be more of an anti-inflammatory scenario. But as we sometimes don't like it, it has also been the opposite has also been suggested or hypothesized. So sometimes that second phase of the cycle is referred to as a more pro-inflammatory environment. So there's really, really, really a lot of contradiction in, especially if you look at individual studies. That's why I picked a systematic review and meta-analysis, which we'll look at in a second, because that one really looked at 110 different studies, and it basically neither confirms one notion or the other, really. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But that's why such consolidated findings are sometimes really helpful. But also note that we are talking about studies that are pooling many different people into groups, and the individual response of the immune system even adds another layer, which we're not about to talk today. We recently had an episode on individuality in medicine, so I'll refer to that. Not so much the focus of today's episode.
So we know we have these hormone receptors, and we know that the estrogen and the progesterone are anti-inflammatory in a cell culture. However, in a human being, more complex, conflicting research.
Exactly. Yeah. Thanks for that summary. So let's look at that meta-analysis and systematic review that really looked at 110 different studies. And what they found is that the different parts of the immune system may be modulated differently across the menstrual cycle. So with those different hormonal profiles across the menstrual cycle. And that's quite interesting. So spoiler is, the adaptive immune system, remember those antibodies, the T lymphocytes, the T killer cells, and so on, the cytokines, or most of the cytokines, they didn't really differ across menstrual cycle phases, indicating that the immune response and inflammatory response may be rather homogeneous across the menstrual cycle for those elements of the immune system. But for some other parts of the immune system, there was a difference. And that held true for those innate immune cells. So those were the ones like the first line of defense of the body. And they were actually elevated in the luteal phase. So higher amount of, for example, monocytes, granulocytes, neutrophils, etc. So those cells were elevated in the luteal versus the follicular phase, so after ovulation. And again, does that translate into a more pro or anti-inflammatory state? We don't really know, because both of them are involved in anti and pro-inflammatory processes. So it's just, we know that there are more of those cells potentially that could hint toward a more pro-inflammatory scenario, because we could kind of interpret that as the body getting ready to detect maybe a pathogen and then reacting with more inflammation. But the finding itself does not necessarily tell us that. And then one second element of the immune system that was also elevated in the second phase of the cycle, in the luteal phase, was leptin. So that's a hormone, a peptide hormone, that is being released from adipocytes, so from your fat cells. And that is definitely thought to be more pro, or lead to more pro-inflammatory release of cytokines. So leptin definitely more associated with pro-inflammatory states, and that innate immune response, first line of defense, kind of amps up their cells, maybe in the second part of the cycle. But remember also that they were involved in some of the reproductive processes, so like ovulation and menses. So maybe the higher number that we saw, or that is seen in that study in the second phase, maybe that's more associated with the reproductive processes themselves, more so than inflammation against a pathogen, for example. And we will see about the musculoskeletal system, because when I gave you that bird's eye view of the immune system, I also mentioned that those innate immune cells are also partly involved in muscle regeneration, for example. So that might be actually a very interesting finding regarding being active or exercise throughout the menstrual cycle phases.
I love this because I just feel like it gives an ode to just how incredibly brilliant and made to adapt all these systems are, both our female reproductive system as well as the immune system, which is always so intriguing and complex and individualized. And I also think it's one of the reasons I love our female health training is because we do really look at the specifics to each person. Like it is so different, even with athletes and with females, how we need to work with their cycle. And I know for me myself, I feel like as far as cycle tracking goes, it really does depend on the month. Maybe that's because I'm perimenopausal, but I do think there's not always like a set part of my cycle that I feel better as far as recovery and performance. And so I think it is really interesting. And this kind of gives us that reminder. And hopefully at some point, maybe we'll learn more about the what, why, and how behind it at some point when we get more research. Which is, as you said, much harder to do, I think, on the specificity of the cycle sometimes. But I mean, it's such a brilliant and complex thing, whether you're talking about immune and inflammation or female reproductive system, and then put them two together, try and make
Yeah.
sense of it, and then add fitness and training into it and performance. I mean, it's a beautiful thing, and I love that we can use our yoga practice to reflect and kind of dig into that nuance and sometimes find some gems of information, and then also what we love to do is adding in that traditional Chinese medicine component too, which to me makes brilliant sense of the female reproductive system in a way that I think Western medicine doesn't so much. So yeah, it ultimately reminds us, especially in the meantime, that we have to rely on the listening, our body awareness, our ability to track and check in and know that it's more than just one thing. It's more than just our cycle that is driving our performance as well, too, or our immune system. So there's always more.
Yeah. You're absolutely right there. I love that how you drew out that it's really two extremely complex systems. So and they interacting that even adds to the complexity, and that's also why I love talking about topics like this on here on the podcast. So those are topics that are not straightforward. So we could actually pick topics for the podcast that are a bit more straightforward. You get your nice takeaways, but I think it doesn't do our brilliant body justice because we do have that complexity and there is still a lot that we don't know, which I find just amazing. I love that. I love always being at the forefront of those new findings, and especially that interaction to me is a really interesting one. And I don't understand a lot of the things about the immune system, but just exploring that and learning about that to me also again reflects the brilliance of our systems. And I also think it really is important at this point in time where we see more and more research emerging, specifically on female hormones, that we pay tribute to the nuance and to the grayscales that we see there. And of course, we always aim to get takeaways also for you guys here in the podcast. But really, let's remember that sometimes the complexity is really to be appreciated. And I think that holds true for this topic here as well.
Yeah, and I think yes to all of that, and also just it's so important right now because I do think there is a lot of talk about training to the female reproductive cycle, and there is more to it. So it's important to, I think, reflect on this. So let's talk a little bit about what all of that. I mean, that was great, and if you have anything else you want to add to that, go for it. But I think looking at how this connects to exercise and performance and recovery, or anything we know so far.
Yeah. And I think this is also where it ties into our active lifestyle and movement practice. So this one study, Nussbaum and colleagues from 2023 that we're referencing, is also looking not only at those general differences in immune cells or inflammatory responses across the menstrual cycle, but then adds in even more complexity by bringing exercise in as well. And exercise, yet another factor that complicates things because the immune system also interacts intricately with exercise. So during exercise, you'll see that immune cells increase in your circulation. And then, as already mentioned, after exercise, there's typically a pro-inflammatory phase, which is absolutely not a bad thing. It is to initiate the acute phase of regeneration. So we need that for those repair cells to come in to really trigger recovery. So we need that pro-inflammatory process after exercise. And then after a while, anti-inflammatory agents also come in to kind of keep that in check. So again, to find that perfect yin and yang, to find that perfect balance for your system to respond to that stimulus that you just gave. And then you can, of course, imagine that different types of exercise, different intensities, all of that will probably also impact that immune response. So a yoga class and a marathon will probably induce different immune responses in your body.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. And again, that reminder that inflammation isn't bad, but a really important part of that stimulus for change as well. And obviously recovery and adaptation, but in the right place, in the right amount, and the right timing, and closing that cycle is really the important part of it. So.
Absolutely. And then one takeaway that I'd like to share from that meta-analysis or systematic review is that they looked at different sports. And again, we find that the findings are quite contradictory. There are not too many studies yet that look at different modalities of exercise. But for one modality or for one type of exercise, there was a bit more robust evidence, and that is for running. So for running, there was a bit more of a clear picture in that meta-analysis. And that's thought to maybe originate from the fact that running puts a quite high metabolic load on your body. So VO2 max, your maximum oxygen consumption, that would be rather high if you do a bout of exercise versus others. I don't know. They also discuss resistance training, where the overall metabolic load may be lower. And we can argue about that. Probably depends on the exact way how you do resistance training again. But here in this study, they specifically found that for running, there was a higher pro-inflammatory answer or response in the second phase of the cycle, so in the luteal phase. Again, still much more to be explored, but I think that's one interesting finding we can highlight, that for running specifically, in the second phase of the cycle, there appeared to be more of a pro-inflammatory milieu there.
So interesting. Yeah. And I mean, we all know there's probably a lot of differentiation about like how you do some of these things and the effects that might come from that. But again, our body's constantly adapting to the demands and having a very intelligent response to that, which makes it much harder to study and know exactly, is it anti-inflammatory, is it pro-inflammatory, and then is that pro-inflammatory a good thing or is it not? I mean, that's really the individualized, that's the part that we don't really get in these, mass, meta-analyses and things to see how the individualized response is, I'm assuming. So
definitely not. And as you mentioned, I mean, it is interesting to just track that for a little while. And that might be maybe a bit more of a clear picture as you're in your premenopausal phase, when the cycle is somewhat more regular. But it might also be interesting to see that there are no changes. So I think just being aware of that, it just can add to our awareness of our overall system, of our body awareness, but generally of our system. I'm saying this as I'm not really at 100% today. So of course I kind of take a mental note and take that with me. And if that then can be attributed to one single factor, I would say probably not. But it's always, I think, very informative to just, have that individual focus on it and just really dig into that and be aware of that for yourself.
And I'm so fascinated by, the idea of cycle training, but I feel like it can also be a bit frustrating, not only because of everything we've talked about in the individuality of this, but also, there's only so much that you can train to your cycle. Like as a tennis player, I can't plan my tennis tournaments around my cycle. And then, you go into a tennis tournament knowing you're on your period or knowing you're at one of these low points, and then you don't want to think about that. We know we can train through that. We know that we can still have great performance, so it's like, how much of this information do I take in? Like, how does my brain, kind of like pain, how do I relate to that in a way that's positive and motivating, but also informs me maybe to like HRV, maybe know when the right time to push or to rest a little bit. And I still think personally that though you'll often see, especially if you have a regular cycle, you can see patterns. There are still, there's still individuality to it. There's still shifts depending on a lot of other contributors, like even just our stress and, injuries or other things. We have to take it all in. And I think yoga gives us such a great the concepts of yoga, of having this non-judgmental body awareness and mind awareness, gives us this foundation to be able to examine a little bit better. Again, taking away some of the emotional complexity, hopefully, which is hard to do, but to be able to just kind of look at our unfiltered experience and be able to respond to that is the general idea.
Yeah. And to me, that's actually at the core or at the essence of the current research landscape, not only on the immune system and menstrual cycle phases, but also when we look at the many, many different studies on performance, strength performance, endurance performance, mobility across the menstrual cycle. In all of those fields, we see contradictory responses. So some studies, or even meta-analyses, indicating that there are no differences across the menstrual cycle, which would be good for your tennis tournament because it then wouldn't really matter when that is, and others showing differences. So if you talk, or when you talk to really the core people in the field of menstrual cycle research, the consensus at the moment is we don't know. So that's maybe, again, not very satisfactory, but I think it's just important to be aware of that. And the takeaway from most of that research and those researchers is that the individual perspective just matters so much. And that's not just like a second thought or, okay, we don't know on group level average. Well, then let's focus on the individual. That's not the takeaway. The takeaway is that probably, kind of likely, that the individual aspect of that can be pretty high or pretty relevant. And that's totally reflecting what you're saying. And that's what practices like yoga that so much focus on creating that body awareness or system awareness, where they can benefit so much, or we can benefit from them so much. So totally underlining what you're saying there.
I always like to start our female health training out with this picture that I have that's hilarious, and it just has all the different processes in the female versus the male, of just like how complex females are. And I like to think of that as like refined and nuanced. We have we have a lot of layers to us, which is wonderful and amazing, but it just means there's a lot more moving parts. And so again, that individuality, I think, just is something to be respected and to see as our innate wisdom, to not necessarily go by some playbook that's given to us, which might work really well for a male counterpart in, the research that's been done on males so far. But for females, it's not quite as straightforward. And so I think it goes along with this, idea of innate wisdom and listening and the importance of that and trusting in what we feel and sense. So hopefully that is just a nice reminder that you are wise.
Perfect ending.
I love that. So hopefully thank you, one, for bringing all this new research. I agree. It's nice to be on the forefront of things. Obviously, there's a lot of mixed information. I think it's really interesting to see this presence of the innate immune system and that elevation of innate immune response during the luteal phase, not necessarily pro or anti-inflammatory, maybe pro-inflammatory, but we see that the immune system is rising to the occasion during that second half of the cycle, and leptin being elevated too, which is a little more pro-inflammatory. But again, a lot of mixed research, and just remembering that it is very individualized. There are a lot of other things contributing to this, and that inner wisdom is such an important part of it. And hopefully in another few years or so or more, we'll have more and more information and maybe uncover a little bit more. But that's where the research is at as of now. So if you're seeing things that feel very black and white on the internet about cycle training, just know that there is more to this. If it doesn't match up with your experience, know that that is real and that is your response that you want to be listening to and following and finding your own way. And again, I think yoga is a nice map for that. So I hope this has been helpful for you guys. Again, we've got a lot of deeper study if you want to. We've got our female health training, we have our menopause training, and of course, many others that you can check out on our website. And of course, many other episodes here with other female health information. So thanks for bringing it, Katja.
My pleasure.
And we'll see you next time.
See ya.
Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you like the show, please be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com, or check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine. You can also email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being a part of our Yoga Medicine community. We look forward to seeing you again. The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.